So I've been thinking about the way we wrapped up our last lecture on L'étourdi with that expression that Lacan has about the wail of an appeal to the real. A wail of an appeal to the real that says, emphasis on the act of saying here, that's not it. This is where we ended our last lecture, with this wail of an appeal to the real that says, that's not it. And you'll recall we coupled this saying with the naysaying, the act of saying no, that according to Lacan typifies every act of speaking. What is said does not and cannot go without saying. But saying is ever escaping from the said, and it does so by saying no to the latter. So you can check out pages 12 and 15 of our packet or our version of L'étourdi, and you can see all this popping. What the act of speaking says about the said when it naysays it is, that's not it. This said, this symptomatic statement, this S1 is not it. Now, up to this point, the it that the symptom is not has been the unconscious. That S2 in the analytic discourse which symbolizes the unconscious truths of a barred subject, truths which cannot be said, yet nevertheless command the barred subject to speak, and in speaking to cough up symptomatic saids. Unconscious truth, to barred subject, to symptomatic statement, S2 to slashed S to S1. Since seminar 17, this has been the motor force of the analytic discourse. Here in L'étourdi, Lacan is adding, or at least foregrounding, two more variables. First, the real that commands the unconscious from a place of logical impossibility, like a big sister to a younger sibling, making the unconscious a response to the real. Second, the lived, embodied act of speaking that allows the barred subject to produce symptomatic expressions. We've got the real and the act of speaking. And Lacan's telling us that these two variables are intimately connected. He says it explicitly on page 16 of our version of the text. Speaking comes from where the real commands the truth. From the real to the act of speaking by way of the part of truth that cannot be said and remains unknown. This is what we've established. And if you want to be diagrammatic about all this, as I sure as hell hope you do, because it's extremely helpful to draw and write this stuff out, go ahead and get out pen and paper and redraw the discourse of the analyst. Relabel the vectors of knowledge and ignorance, with the former extending from symptom to analyst, S1 to A, as the part of truth that can be said and known, and the latter extending from unconscious to barred subject, S2 to slashed S, as the part of truth that cannot be said and remains unknown. Now, recall also the positions in this diagram of the real and the act of speaking. The real commands the part of truth that can't be said, and the act of speaking commands the part of truth that can be said. Now, I went ahead and redrew this morning, as always, over a cup of coffee, so you can see how this is all shaping up. Here from S1 up to A, you have knowledge, the part of truth that can be said, commanded by this little circle here, which is the act of speaking. In black, you've got S2 up to slashed subject. Here is ignorance, the part of truth that cannot be said, and it is being commanded by the unconscious, here occupying that delta. So the red arrow that you see in the diagram I'm holding up for you shows the trajectory from the real to the act of speaking by way of the part of truth that cannot be said. I think this is a pretty helpful way to draw it, at least for me. I would encourage you to draw it similarly or to come up with a way that works for you. But make no mistake, the topology here is that of the discourse or the matheme of the analyst. And it's an extremely helpful diagram to work each of these topics through. Because as you can see, these motherfuckers hang together fairly nicely. And it's not a coincidence. Now, what of these positions that we've been working with, the real and the act of speaking? Here's what we can see when we stack them up. We see two existents commanding two trajectories of truth. That's important here. The real and the act of speaking are both existents, and they command, each in their own way, a different part of truth. So the real commands the part of truth that cannot be said, and the act of speaking commands the part of truth that can be said. So you have two existents commanding two trajectories of truth. It's one way to think about what's happening here. Analyst, analysand, symptom, and the unconscious. All of these four variables operate according to a logic of truth. That's what we've been establishing in the past couple of lectures. But not so with the real and the act of speaking, sensei and student alike. They both exceed all logics of truth. Relative to truth, the real and the act of speaking are always out of place. That's why I'm using the term existence here. They are outside, out of place, a place apart from the place in which truth reigns. So you have the two parts of truth firing very well in the standard mapping of the discourse of the analyst. And what we're adding here with the real and the act of speaking are two spots in the discourse of the analyst that are out of place relative to these trajectories of truth. They just don't fit in truth. They exist, the part of truth that can be said and the part of truth that can't. And that's not all that speaking has learned from the real. Recall, the act of speaking's capacity to naysay the said. It's the real by way of the unconscious truth and barred subjectivity that taught us how to do this. And again, that's why I emphasize the term sensei here. Our ability to say no was a lesson we learned by way of the part of truth that can't be said, commanded by the real. How? Why? Because the word which slices, the word which cuts, the word which decides, if you'll recall from our last lecture, in the real's commandment to the unconscious and from the unconscious to the speaking subject is no. That's how we learned to say it. At issue here, of course, is the no of the father, the negative one of the unary trait. The unary trait as uniment, as Lacan puts it here. And an uniment that he links directly to the phallic function. It's on page 46 of our version. Check it out. In short, what we're talking about here is the inscriptive, incisional, impossible because lost to oblivion logic of castration. And I want to be axiomatic with all this shit. It's by way of castration that we learn to say no. You want it in a word, you want it in a bumper sticker, that's it. It's by way of castration that we learn to say no. In what sense? This is undoubtedly among our key questions here. In what sense does the act of speaking say no to what is said? So far, we've got our 5 senses, all at play in the discourse of the analyst. Established in our first 2 lectures in this series, there's the ab-sex sense of the real that instructs the ab-sense of the unconscious, that instructs the dissension of the barred subject, that instructs the nonsense of the symptom, that instructs the analyst sense of how the unconscious works. So here's a question. Does the act of saying, which traces its origin to the ab-sex sense of the real, also have a sense of its own? In our second round of reading for this series, on page 48 of our version of L'Etour de Lacan answers this question. The sense of speaking, he writes, is a sense of negation, dispossession, and denial, all of which he captures in a single term, a weird one at that, Nyania. Nyania is a mashup of 2 different words that sound exactly the same, and I don't even know if you could call both of them words. There's one spelled N-Y-A, pronounced Nia, and another spelled N-I-A, pronounced Nia. This term is key. It's on page 48 of our packet, and I encourage you to track it down. The second Nia, spelled N-I-A, is from the French verb nier, meaning to deny. The first Nia, spelled N-Y-A, is a contraction of Lacan's famous il n'y a, meaning there is no, as in there is no sexual relationship. We could make much of this N-Y-A, this there is no, and Lacan certainly invites us to do so. The relation of the impossible real to the act of speaking, he tells us on page 19 of our text, mid-450s in the other écrit, if that's where you're reading this in the French. He says this relation is one of encirclement. The real encircles the act of speaking with logical impossibility, impossibility which is announced as, pardon the cough, but that's how it's announced. Pardon the clearing of my throat, but that's how it sounds. There is no sexual relationship. And this saying, there is no sexual relationship, is just that, an enunciation, an act of saying, simply the act of saying Nia, N-Y-A, Lacan claims. But don't be fooled, my friends. This may be a simple saying, one part axiom and one part act, but its logical consequences are anything but. I want you to also just notice that move. It's a move Lacan is making very elusively in this essay. The saying in question here is often the act of speaking, a speech event, but it also has to do with axioms, with maxims, with little sayings, like the sun only shines on a dog's ass once, which I distinctly remember my grandfather telling my younger brother when my brother won the lottery. It wasn't a big deal, but for us as teenagers, when brother came home with $1,000 ticket, woo-wee, everybody was excited. Now my grandfather, he was there just to remind my brother and all within earshot that the sun only shines on a dog's ass once. Now, that is a saying. That is what my man Kenneth Burke would call equipment for living. Whether my brother took it to heart, I certainly hope he did not. This encircling is what we're working with here. And I throw this bit in about saying so you can have it in mind whenever I say saying in these lectures. I'm at once playing with the act and the axiom. the activity of speaking and the axiomatic function of a saying. Let's get back to this encirclement, though. If the real encircles the act of speaking, this act of speaking, with its there is no, Nyania, confirms the real, and in so doing assures it as well. The real encircles saying, and saying confirms the real. Not at the level of enunciation again, but at its limit, the limit which it establishes as its logical consequence, as Lacan puts it here. He adds that it is an immediate limit. It's on page 20. Why immediate? Because there isn't, Nyania, anything to make a relationship from the enunciation that says there is no sexual relationship. You can't make a rapport out of that shit. All we have with that saying is a speech event, an act of speaking, a saying, which says there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. If ever there was a saying in Lacanian theory, I wouldn't dare say technique, but in theory, it's there is no sexual relationship. You might say that the unconscious is structured like a language. That might also be another saying. Lacan is full of sayings. And in a very crystallized sense, the matheme, the diagram, the graph, algebraic symbols in many ways for Lacan, these are all sayings, little rhymes, little jingles that ideally can be transmitted without remainder. But this act and fact of speaking is where we are at. This act and fact of saying there's no such thing as a sexual rapport, sexual relationship. This act and fact of speaking, even if we repeat it together all at once, do it with me, 1, 2, 3, there is no sexual rapport. Even if we say it all at the same fucking time, it's insufficient to establish what this saying itself negates, namely a sexual relationship, defined here as immediacy, transparency, union, telepathy, in short, wholeness with an other, be it someone else or even more elusively, ourselves. And this last one is key. I'll throw another saying out instead of elaborating on it further. It's one from my friend John Durham Peters, and it goes like this: I am the alien from outer space. But what's going on? Lacan interjects at this point, and rightly so, because seriously, what the fuck is going on here? It's a question of the relationship between man and woman, Lacan explains. Because they inhabit language, he says, their relationship is not sexual, but spoken. Their relationship is defined by the fact that they never stop talking about their relationship. And because these tireless enunciations mediate between their masculine and feminine mouthpieces, functioning as a go-between, and thus something that divides the very entities it connects, the relationship men and women long for, one of union, completion, and uteromorphic bliss, must remain ever distant, irrevocably absent, and for this very reason, designatory of sex, of the sexual, and of what they both repeat, the real. Now, if you've seen page 21 of the Tour D, of the version we're looking at, you know I'm just riffing on what Lacan has going here. But the point that I want to emphasize is this bit about talk. The relationship, or lack thereof, however you want to figure it, between men and women is defined by the fact that they never stop talking about this relationship. And this talking about functions as a medium, a go-between, one that connects as much as it divides, which is precisely what the media theorists tuning into this lecture know backwards and forwards. So, you want to know what the wail of an appeal to the real sounds like? It sounds like Nia, 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 voiced again and again and again, encore. There isn't anything between us. You want to know what all that talk sounds like at a bone-deep level where it resonates most? There isn't anything between us. Except, of course, this very utterance. Except, of course, this saying, this act and axiom. A saying which always says, no, that's not it. It says, no, that's not it. To what? To every profession of love. Except, of course, a Lacanian profession of love, which, as we know, always beats the beloved to this response by saying it first. This profession of love is not that about which it speaks. Recall our recent lectures on love. This is what it sounds like. This is the nature of the love letter. This profession of love in this letter is not that about which I am writing. Before the depths of my love for you, words fail, these included. My love for you, let me be clear, is not true, but real. But I digress. And for good reason, because that's exactly what real love does with our longing for a sexual rapport with someone else. Hear me now. Real love simply walks away from that shit, sidestepping its illusory horizon. Digression, digressus, digredi. A diss on the Proto-Indo-European verb meaning to walk. Now, you've heard that the unconscious is structured like a language, even as recently as a few minutes ago when I searched for another famous saying of Lacan's. But here I want to add something else, perhaps another saying that you can keep in your wallet. The opposite is also true of language and the unconscious. Every language also has an unconscious of its own. And you just heard me fucking with it around the word digression. The word for the unconscious that every language has is etymology. And etymology, of course, is a word with its own etymology. It's the study, logia, of a word's true meaning, etios. And before the advent of voice recording technologies like the phonograph, the tape recorder, and all that shit, it was always at the level of the word, of the said, that this study of a word's true meaning took place. What remained out of reach, just beyond this place, was the voice, and with it the act of speaking. Not the said, my friends, but the saying. And not the true meaning of a word, but if we could be a bit playful here, what I would call its real sense. Lord, am I digressing again? Did I just do it again? Absolutely not. The sense of speaking, as Lacan puts it, that we castrated beings inherit from the real, is not Nia, but it's sonic, homophonic, doubling. It's Nyania. That's the word he's using. It's a doubling of a saying that sounds just like another, Nyania, N-Y-A plus N-I-A, Nia. Two different words meaning two different things, but sounding exactly alike when voiced in French, Nia. We know what's up with the first Nia, spelled N-Y-A, at least enough to get us started. But what about that second one? That second one spelled N-I-A, Nia. I told you it's from the French verb nier, meaning to deny. Nia is the simple past tense of this verb. It points to a denial stated in the past. Lacan is all over this in Lecture D. Check out page 20 in our version of the text, for instance. Nia, spelled N-I-A, meaning there was denied. Lacan writes that this Nia brings along just enough homophony in the French in order from the past that it signifies to indicate that there is no trace, here using the other Nia, N-Y-A, of any present whose existence can be connoted there. Page 20, you can check it out on your own. But what the fuck does this mean? What he's saying here, in other words, is that this second Nia, in the sense of speaking that goes Nia, Nia, signifies an act or denial in the past, a denial that is in fact an act in the past, performed by someone or something, but here's the catch, whose existence we have no fucking evidence of. What Lacan is saying is that the N-I-A that shows up second in Nia, Nia, it signifies an act of denial in the past, performed by someone or something whose existence, then and now alike, we have no evidence of. Where is this someone or something, then or now, who actively denied? We don't have it. There is no evidence of this. And this is precisely what the first Nia, spelled N-Y-A, says to the second. Another saying for y'all. There is no evidence, past or present, of the one who denied. Nia, Nia. Who denied what? The very thing that allows us to say there is no sexual rapport, and every other embodied utterance that passes from us in what Lacan wonderfully describes here as a labial way. What is it that allows us to say things like, there is no sexual rapport? There is not anything between us. What allows us to say things like this? You know the words I'm searching for. Castration, and by extension, the phallic function. Now, we've discussed all of these terms. Castration, the phallic function, and all the sprinklings of concepts that come with that. But I think it's worth, at this point, before we get back into these formulas of sexuation, to review very quickly what it is that we're doing here. How we get from something like castration to the phallic function. And we can do this quick and dirty. Let's start at the beginning, where we all start. Society, the neighborhood, the family, the world into which, between piss and shit, as Augustine put it, we are all dropped. Society, you've often heard me say, is a field in which certain behaviors are promoted and other behaviors are prohibited. It's a field of promotion and prohibition. When you drop into the world between piss and shit, you're immediately wrapped up in a blanket that's either pink or blue. And when you get home, your room is either painted pink or blue. And when you start getting dressed, your clothes are either full of dresses and pants or pants and, you know what I'm saying? You see the world is already structuring the field of your possible conduct. It's okay, dear girl, to love the color pink, but do not choose blue as your favorite color. There are promoted behaviors and prohibited behaviors, all of which, when taken together, produce an experience known as constraint, what Foucault calls a limited or controlled field of possible conduct. And the word that we use for this is castration. Castration is this experience of constraint where it feels like your field of possibilities are constrained, limited. And that comes from the simple fact that society is structured atop promotions and prohibitions. Now, we've talked about this experience of constraint that society gives us as a trajectory from loss to lack to desirous subjectivity. We've been over that enough. I think you understand it. But this last bit is key. What's up with this desirous subjectivity that grows out of a field in which conduct has been limited, in which the field of possibilities has been constrained? This desirous subjectivity that does not have access to all the modes of conduct. Here we see someone in search of completion, consistency, and above all, wholeness, from loss to lack to desire, which is a pursuit of completion, consistency, and above all, wholeness. What I would add, though, as we start thinking about the sexual relationship and lack thereof, is that the type of wholeness Lacan has in mind here in the early 1970s is not exactly wholeness with another. This is not part of his Aristophanic reading of naive love, where you see love as two people coming together and completing one another, and the sexual relationship completion with another. That's here, but it's not central. The wholeness in question that we see pursued by desirous subjects in societies defined by prohibition and promotion is not that of wholeness with another, but instead wholeness with themselves. And the reason why these two things are connected is that all too often what we see as a desirous subject using or instrumentalizing others in order to feel whole themselves. The other becomes a means to the end of autonomy. That's the type of wholeness that we see at stake here. And the way that I would put that is the way that I put it in our last series. Forgive me the Kantianisms here. What we see is a transition from heteronomy to autonomy. This is the basic fantasy. In fact, the fantasy would be autonomy papered over heteronomy. Feelings of self-sufficiency that obscure the fact that we rely on others in order to sustain those feelings. Now, I don't want to get too far into this. I just want to tell you what that shit is called. It's called the phallic function. The phallic function is this transition from heteronomy, reliance on others different from oneself, in order to sustain feelings of autonomy, self-legislation from the Greek. That whole procedure is exactly how the phallic functions. But back to our main point here. We simply have no evidence of anyone, at any time, in any way, by any communicative means, negating this function, the phallic function. That's the main point here. That's what Nyania says on first glance. We don't have any evidence of anyone at any time, in any way, by any communicative means, negating the phallic function. Indeed, anyone who has ever attempted to do as much, because they could only make this attempt in language by way of the symbolic, proves just the opposite, demonstrating that they are, in fact, beholden to the phallic function and its castrative logics. You want to know what allows us to speak, what allows us to say things like there is no sexual rapport? The fact that we are castrated, the fact that we live in a field that is constrained. That's what allows us also to speak, because it's a field that shows us plugged into a symbolic order. The dilemma here could be simply summed up like this. It would be like me saying, right now, I am not speaking. My act of speaking, by its very existence as speech, would undermine the veracity of what it is I'm saying. What it is being said, claimed, and stated as true. For me to say I'm not speaking right now, the very fact that I'm using speech to do this would undermine the veracity of what this saying says, of what is said by so speaking. You see where I'm going with this? And notice, it is being stated as true. We went through all this in our last series on Seminar 19B or worse, so I'm not going to pursue it much further here, at least not from this angle. Suffice it to say, for the same reason that there can be no meta-language, it's impossible to negate the phallic function in speech, in discourse, in socio-communicative practices defined by a field in which the possible conduct of everyone is limited. Without, though, simultaneously reinforcing its existence. And that's the dilemma. It's impossible to negate the phallic function in speech without at the very same time reinforcing its existence, because it's prerequisite to the act of speaking. You've heard of the liar's paradox. What I'm trying to get us to is what might be called the naysayer's paradox. But it's men and women and their non-rapport that interests Lacan here, more than all the communicative practice, constrained, and the like. Lacan figures everybody's got that under their belt. And he's like, let's get on to talking about men and women and their non-rapport. I think it's great that he does this. It expects a lot of us as readers, but I also think it's well worth taking this leap with him, because I think it's here in the shift to men and women that things really get interesting, especially around the sense of speaking known as Nyania. The second Nia in this utterance, spelled N-I-A, is masculine, and it recalls Lacan's first formula of masculine subjectivity. And I love it that we find ourselves in this dilemma of once more having to talk our way through these formulas of sexuation that don't use letters normally in an alphabetic way, and whose letters, non-alphabetized, don't stack up to easily described signifiers. So the formula here in question that the second N-I-A, Nia, connects to is that first formula of masculinity. You can probably envision it in your mind. Here, let me try and just describe it. There's a backwards capital E next to a little x. And then there's a capital I with a little circle in the middle of it next to another x. And then above the big I X is a line. Now, what that means is something different, but the way the formula is written, here, I'll hold it up on the screen so you can see it, looks something like this. Perhaps this is enough for you to recall it. If not, what are you going to think I recommend? I'm going to recommend you get out pen and paper and write that shit down. It's important to have this written out, and that's part and parcel of why Lacan is doing it this way. These formulas are best written. But I can also, in response to that pure writing, offer some commentary. Here's how I read this formula, this first formula of masculinity with the backwards EX next to the capital PHX with a line over the top. It says, there exists someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment negate or deny or oppose the phallic function, So if you want, you can read that backwards E as a reminder of existence. It says there exists. And the line over the top of any given part of any of these formulas is a negation. It negates whatever pops underneath it. So the phallic function is written capital Phi X. And here you've got a line over the top that negates it. And preceding that, you've got the backwards EX of existence. And the way we read it is to say, there exists someone, at least one, somebody, somewhere, whose speech, action, and enjoyment negate, there's that line, or deny or oppose the phallic function, NIA. Here, as you know, is that quintessential masculine fantasy, which I never tire of taking apart. And when I say masculine fantasy, I don't mean that it's exclusively limited to bodies with penises. This is not an exclusively male fantasy. It's a masculine fantasy. I know women who enjoy according to masculine structures. You do as well. Here is that quintessentially masculine fantasy, bearing in mind that it ain't got nothing to do with your swimsuit zone. A fantasy of an exceptional, real man who enjoys without limit, without constraint, apart from castration, as though there are no prohibited behaviors. Just like the mythical father of the primal horde that Freud told us about. Check in with any of our last series and you'll see this thing coming up because it's exactly what Lacan is talking about in his seminars leading up to Liturgy, more often than not. The first Nia, spelled N-Y-A, however, is not masculine. It does, however, point to that masculine fantasy, as we're going to see. The first Nia, spelled N-Y-A, is feminine and finds expression as a negation of the masculine fantasy you just heard me describing, a masculine fantasy well captured in the first formula of masculine subjectivity that we just discussed. This masculine wager, and that's what it is, it's a wager, that there was or is anyone capable of negating the phallic function. The first Nia, N-Y-A, in Nia, calls bullshit on that. It negates that fantasy. And the way that we write this in Lacan's algebra is the same formula you had on the masculine side, but add a line above the EX. So in the formulas I'm holding up for you to show, on the masculine side it says there exists someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment negates the phallic function. There's the bar over it. When it comes to the feminine side, we see the same formula, but with the addition of a bar over the EX, which allows us to say there does not exist anyone, anywhere, at any time, whose speech, action, and enjoyment negates the phallic function. So that's just it. The second Nia says there exists someone who can deny, and the first Nia says there does not exist anyone of this sort, represented here by the first formula of feminine subjectivity that Lacan gives us. There does not exist someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment deny the phallic function, and with it castrative logics. So check it out. Zoom out for a second. Don't get too caught in these weeds. Just notice what's happening here. Men go around saying, Nia, 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 and meaning one thing. But women go around saying Nia, 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 and meaning something else entirely. And this, dear brothers and sisters, is where things go south. Because it sounds like men and women are saying the same thing. Nia, 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 Nia. And because it sounds like they're saying the same thing, they assume that they think the very same thing, and thus that they understand each other. I say Nia, you say Nia, hot damn, we are in agreement. All of this, however, according to Lacan, is just a filler. It fills in or compensates for the fact that in actuality, there is no understanding. There is no relationship between men and women. Nor has there ever been, as he goes on to insist on page 48. Again, using the French verb nier. So how then should we translate this nia in light of what we've heard about its masculine and feminine components and the homophonous, illusory sense of agreement that they sustain? What indeed is the sense of speaking that this nia allows us to articulate? One translation, the most useful one for our purposes, you've already heard. There does not exist, nor has there ever existed, anyone capable of naysaying the phallic function. You got that one under your belts. But this last riff about how the homophonous nias of men and women fill in for the irreducible lack or absence of a sexual rapport between them, supplementing an absex sense, if you will, it invites us to consider another translation of this nia. It marks a mutual denial of the fact that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. Nia, pronounced by masculine and feminine subjects alike, it marks a mutual denial of the fact that there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. So, what connects men and women? You might be wondering. It's their overwhelming conviction that saying the same thing equals meaning the same thing equals union without remainder, until, of course, death do us part. Whoops.